You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nutrition Matters podcast. My name is Paige, and I'm your host. And I'm excited to bring you this episode 146 of the podcast, all about demystifying gut health and the microbiome. And I couldn't think of a better person to bring on to have this conversation than none other than Jessie Hoffman herself. So welcome to the podcast, Jessie.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So before we dive into the topic today, I wanted to just say a couple things. First of all, thanks so much to everyone who leaves a review for the podcast. It's always so appreciated. It's helpful for me to continue to be able to do this work. It helps people find the show. So if you haven't been able to do that already, just take a minute, leave a review, and just kind of let me know how the information is sinking in for you and how you're doing with it. Another thing to keep in mind is I do have some resources available for you. So as you know, I have this podcast called Nutrition Matters Podcast. I also have a blog available at positive-nutrition.com with lots of years worth of blog posts there to kind of learn more about this stuff in a different way. Sometimes you learn things differently through reading than you do through listening. So check that out. Also, I have what's called the Positive Nutrition Academy. This is really exciting, a really exciting project where I have now 3 online courses there. I have Positive Nutrition for Life, which is a course that takes you about 3 to 6 months to complete. Lots of journaling prompts, walking through mindfulness and body image stuff, and the intuitive eating book, and then ending in positive nutrition. I also have a course with Jessie, who's here with me today. We co-taught a course called Positive Nutrition 101. This is all about the science of nutrition, some of the most important things we think can be really helpful to stay out of the dieting mentality when you understand certain elements of nutrition science. And then my most recent course I released is called the Mindful Eating Workshop, and this is an online version of an in-person workshop that Noah Rasheta and I, host of the Secular Buddhism podcast. It's an online version of a course or of a workshop that we put on twice in Salt Lake City, and that one we're really proud of as well. Now I am putting together smaller courses that are just called webinars for the Positive Nutrition Academy, and I do have some that are available for continuing education credits for dietitians, and then some that are for the lay public. So when I record these live, you can attend and you can ask questions, but then they're also available through the Academy for purchase at any time. So if you're interested in just like little tidbits versus an online course, there's just lots of different options there. So be sure to check that out. You can find the Positive Nutrition Academy at positive-nutrition.com/academy. Okay, so with that, Jessie, I already said hello to you. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is going to be fun. I'm excited to talk about gut health and everything.
So the listeners will know that every once in a while I have the honor and privilege of interviewing people in person, and that's just what we're doing today here in Salt Lake City in my office. This is your second time being in town with me. It's so fun.
Yeah, exactly a year ago. I was out here for your first mindful eating workshop. So
Perfect.
It's good to be back.
And we just had a fun Utah Springs situation here with just a dump of snow overnight. And yesterday we were like not in shorts, but like you could have been in shorts yesterday with the weather.
Yeah, it was actually really warm. I was playing outside.
Yeah, totally. Spring in Utah, guys. It's good times. So just take a minute and introduce yourself to any listeners who maybe haven't listened to our previous episode together. Just kind of give them a feel for who you are and what you do, and then we'll dive into gut health.
So I am Jessie Hoffman, and I just finished my PhD in nutritional sciences. So a little background on my education. So I went my undergrad for just biology. So I went to a very small school in South Carolina that nobody's ever heard of. And then I decided about halfway to 3/4 of the way through to switch my goals and go get my master's in nutrition. So I went to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro there for my master's in nutrition, which was incredibly fun. I learned so much during my master's, and that program is just incredible if you get the opportunity to go to that one. So I started doing research there. I really was funded to study grapes and their effects on health. And we dabbled into the gut microbiome in those studies, and that's what really got me interested in the microbiome. So when I decided to do my PhD, I ended up going to the University of Kentucky for my PhD studies and was accepted into a lab that is funded to study toxicology research. So we studied environmental pollutants and their effects on health and cardiovascular disease. And I joined the lab and nobody was studying gut health. But what was interesting was that the primary route of exposure to the pollutants that we were studying is through consumption of contaminated food products. So naturally, I convinced my mentor to allow me to dive a little bit into the gut. And so my entire dissertation was really centered around the effects of these environmental pollutants on gastrointestinal health and how that translated to overall cardiovascular and cardiometabolic health, and then how we could potentially intervene with prebiotic nutritional interventions. So, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means. But yeah, that was basically.
Yeah. Are you impressed yet, listeners? I love Jessie. So Jessie, well, talk about what you've been doing with me.
Over the past year?
Yeah.
So over the past year, I've been interning with Paige, learning more and more about private practice and what it's like to be a dietitian and things like that. We've done a lot of cool things together. So we mentioned the Positive Nutrition 101 course, which was so fun to do. And I've been really appreciative for everything she's done for me because she's really opened a lot of doors for me in the dietetics field and introduced me to tons of different people. And yeah, I'm learning that I really want to get into private practice now.
Right. So your next thing is, and the reason you're here is, so when you become a dietitian, the typical route is like studying dietetics in your undergrad and then doing an internship after you graduate. And it's like you pay tuition to work for free, basically. Yep. So with your PhD already, you just have to do a few rotations to kind of fulfill that internship requirement, and then you'll sit for the RD exam probably this summer sometime, right?
Probably in the fall.
In the fall.
I'll do really intensive clinical rotation work this summer, and then I'll try to study for a little bit, and then take it in the fall. Yeah, but that was something interesting. So during my master's, when I decided that I wanted to be a dietitian and I naturally did not have any of the dietetics coursework, I started kind of chipping away at the coursework starting my master's, knowing that I needed that DPD verification statement, which dietetic students will understand. You have to take certain classes and meet certain competencies in order to get that, in order to even apply for an internship. So I chipped away at some of those during my master's and then kept going during my PhD and was met with a lot of resistance from the graduate school that I was taking undergraduate classes that weren't related to my major, quote unquote, which doesn't make sense, FYI. So I was met with a lot of resistance, and then I actually found out that the Academy has a program called ISPPs for PhDs. So it looks a little bit different in that we don't have to go through the traditional DICAS application process and matching process, which is incredibly stressful and difficult. So it actually ended up working out in my favor. And so I do have a lot of those dietetic coursework under my belt. But I was also able to find an alternative route, which actually works for me better. So.
Yeah. And so it was so cool when you were looking into this internship, I was like, well, if they let you come out here, you should. So here we are.
Yeah.
Months later, she's doing a formal rotation with me in my practice, which has been super fun so far. And if you're listening to this episode kind of soon after it airs, we're also putting on a workshop in Salt Lake City with Lexi and Lindsay Kite of Beauty Redefined on April 4th at the University of Utah. In the evening, we're going to be talking about lots of nutrition myths and body image resilience and intuitive eating, and it'll be a really fun night. So that's one of the things we'll do together while you're here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to do that. So that's going to be like in addition to the internship. So a lot of things with the internship, I'm able to actually see one-on-one counseling and learn from Paige how to appropriately do that, which is really fun. But then the workshop is kind of on top of that. So
yeah,
it's a fun little experience that I get to do as well.
So that little section would be really interesting to dietetic students and anyone who's interested in kind of the route, a different route to become a dietitian. But let's dive into talking about gut health. So you've already talked a little bit about your background and some of the research that you have kind of dove into over the years. I am really curious. Do you feel like you've done a good job summarizing that, or do you want to dive into it a little bit more? Do you want to kind of go into the realm of what you learned from doing?
Yeah, so I'll probably remain on the surface for my pollutant research and studies because that gets really heavy toxicology and gene expression and all that kind of stuff. And we'll kind of talk surfacely, and I can kind of mention things that I found in my studies as we go throughout and talk about different topics. So I guess we can start off and talk about how my mindset has changed with regards to gut health as I've actually studied it. So I think during my master's, when we kind of just dabbled in it, I was like, this is the coolest new thing. Gut health influences everything, which it does have its, holds in a lot of different things like mental health and stuff like that. But I think I learned throughout my studies that we don't really know as much as a lot of people lead on that we do. So this field is relatively new in the whole realm of science in general. We've really only studied gut health pretty extensively for the past probably 10 to 15 years. And the gut health research has really picked up in the past 5 to 7 years and has really just boomed. And there's so many different avenues looking at it. So in the realm of science, that is just the tiniest drop. And what that really says for human research is we don't have any long-term studies on gut health. We don't have any long-term studies on the gut microbiome and how nutrition affects that. So that just means we're going to learn a lot in the next 20 to 30 years regarding gut health and the gut microbiome and stuff like that. But the level that we're at currently is we understand the microbes that are there to a big extent when we can sequence what is in, when we use humans, we look at what's in the feces. So we can understand what's there and how the population will change over time and look at measures that are like called diversity, which is a pretty good indicator of the relative abundance of different bacterial species and their proportions compared to each other. But we don't really understand the functions of a lot of these bacteria. We know a few, but when it comes down to it, it's really hard to tease out functions because there are thousands of bacterial species, and even there's strain differences within species that affect their function. So there's just so much to be learned, and it's going to take years to even get there.
So let's take a big step back, just in case somebody is really unaware of some of the words we're using and some of the language. Let's just kind of make sure everyone's on the same page. So what is the gut? What do you mean by the gut? And what do you mean by like microbiome? And what do you mean by bacteria? And kind of just give some of the basics there so that people understand.
Yeah. So the gut would typically be, in my, when I speak about it, I'm really talking about like your small intestine, your large intestine, which would be your colon, That's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the gut. So I'm talking about just those areas. But when people talk about your gastrointestinal system, that starts at your mouth. So that goes from your mouth to your esophagus, to your stomach, to your small intestine, which has several different parts that serve different purposes. Then you reach your large intestine, which there's an interface between your small intestine and your large intestine called the cecum. And in humans, this is relatively small, but that's where a big population of bacteria reside, because they help break down plant compounds and things that are indigestible to us. So a lot of times that's fiber. So that lies at the interface between our small intestine and our large intestine. And what we see is in like rodents and things like that, that is way larger in proportion, because that makes sense. They rely on plant compounds for nutrients. And so what happens is when we digest things that are indigestible by our own enzymes that help us break down food to absorb it, our microbes are then have access to that. And microbes actually have the enzymes to break down things like fiber. And what they do for us is when they break that down, when they're metabolizing it, they release things called short chain fatty acids, which then can be absorbed by either our intestinal cells and used directly there, or they can get all the way to our liver, and then maybe some that get into like systemic circulation. And those have effects on serving as energy fuel for our cells and things like that. So what we see is in humans, that's a very small proportion that contributes to our energy. But when you look at something that consumes plants all the time, like rodents, it contributes to actually pretty large proportion. So that's why their cecums would be much larger.
Yeah. So like what you're saying is, even when you eat something, or when rodents, especially when they eat something that they can't digest, they still get the energy out of it, kind of in a roundabout way, like from the bacteria that then have that as a byproduct.
Yeah.
That then sometimes goes into circulation and like fuels the body.
Yes. And then even what's really interesting is I've worked with a microbiologist who studies ruminants.
Which, explain what that is.
So basically, without like probably getting way too gross into detail,
it's okay.
But they basically have kind of like a second stomach. So they have in their rumen, it is full of bacteria. And so what happens there is the microbes will digest tons of plant matter, because think about these animals. Cows are a really good example. They really only eat plant matter. And so they have to be able to extract all they can to get energy from that. So their microbes tend to be incredibly important. So basically they get two passes at it. They get their rumen, which is predominantly where they are able to digest a lot of that. And then it moves into their stomach. And some of these ruminants actually still do have a cecum, which can then ferment again. So they really highly rely on fermentation and the products produced from that. The breakdown of indigestible compounds to extract energy, which is really cool.
So the microbiome is like a vast thing that has like lots of different types of organisms inside of it that help us basically digest digest our food, but then also has other functions as well, right?
Yeah. So when we talk about the microbiome or the microbiota, which I'll use interchangeably, some scientists there is a slight distinction whether we're talking about the genome versus what actually is there, the populations of things. But the microbiome really talks about things, so bacteria, viruses, fungi, and things like that. But most of the research you're going to read about the microbiome is when it talks about the microbiome or microbiota, it's talking about the bacteria that reside there, and how their presence and the things they produce and the way they interact with our human body affects other processes.
So someone hearing that there's fungus and viruses and bacteria inside of them, just talk about that a little bit and kind of help chill people out about that, like hearing those words.
Yeah, so we think all of these things are terrible. And so the idea is that, yes, in an overabundance of certain things, you can have negative outcomes. So an example of that in our gut would be an infection of C. diff, which is a bacterial infection, Clostridium difficile, which it's now being changed to a different name, but it's still going to be considered C. diff. But so that is pretty much always residing in our intestine. the problem becomes is we'll see this with a lot of
same with like E.
use.
coli.
Yeah,
right?
same with E. coli. It's
Yeah.
there. If you sequence the feces of people, you usually find E. coli there. The issue becomes when that is an overabundance relative to other bacterial populations, so it can outcompete those. And we see this happen with a lot of antibiotic use. So when you're utilizing antibiotics and things like that, you are knocking back a large proportion of bacteria. It's specific to certain bacteria based on what antibiotic you're taking. But when you're knocking those back, these microbes exist in kind of a competitive environment. You're giving certain ones the ability to thrive. So C. diff is a pretty bad infection that you see in a lot of times hospital settings because a lot of people there are on antibiotics. So it's pretty gnarly. And then the treatment, of course, is more antibiotics. So it can really wreak havoc on your gastrointestinal tract. But the whole idea is that these things are always there, but when they get out of whack, which we call dysbiosis, that's when you see problems.
So, okay, great. I love everything you've said. There's a big kind of trend in talking about like gut health right now. So what does that even mean, and what is a healthy gut? And also, I'm asking you a lot of questions all at once, but one more question is the sort of gold standard we have right now for determining, quote, gut health, like is that even like scientifically like solid right now?
Yeah, so gut health is like it's become kind of fad diety, like a buzzword and thrown around. And I really don't, there is really no strict definition on what gut health looks like.
Kind of like health in general is really hard to define, right?
Yeah. It's going to look different for every person.
Yes.
So your microbiome is going to look different from someone else's. And, maybe that is okay. And maybe that's quote unquote health for you and gut health for you. And maybe that microbiome in someone else would not function as good. So gut health is a very just buzzwordy term. Like in my mind, just gut health in general would be the absence of like gastrointestinal disease. Like that's how I would define gut health.
But a lot of people associate it with like taking probiotics, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I want to have a healthy gut, so I'll take this probiotic. And I want to dive into that, maybe not right this minute, but that's sort of the general assumption is like, oh, now I'm being healthy for my gut.
Yeah. So, and people get caught on to, I mean, this is with any sort of field in health. They want the magic bullet, the magic pill that just achieves health. When there's way more that happens behind the scenes and it's not that surface level. So yeah, gut health is a tricky thing to define, and I don't really think you can define it right now.
Okay, I love that. I think that that's helpful, because when people see that buzzword around, I think it'll be nice for them to kind of think twice, like, wait, what does this even mean? And is there even a good definition? And just knowing someone who's studied it, like you have, has a really hard time even really defining what that even would look like or means, and just kind of leaving room for it to be very individual too. I think that's helpful.
And we've talked about the idea of just health in general before, and that I don't see it as something you reach. I see it as not a goal, but a value. So something that you can engage in. So you can engage in gut promoting behaviors and activities and even certain things that you consume that could be more gut health promoting, but it's not something you just like achieve and have. I guess
right.
That's what.
And it's not necessarily probiotics for every person.
Exactly.
I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, there's also lots of different kinds of probiotics, lots of different amounts of cultures that you're taking when you take a probiotic. So it's not like one size fits all. It's just a really nuanced, tricky discussion, right?
Yeah. And so I guess let's dive into probiotics a little bit since we're kind of talking about them.
Okay.
Because so probiotics are a tricky thing. Research supports their use in quote unquote unhealthy individuals. So when we say unhealthy individuals, a lot of the people that have benefited from specific probiotic use are people with inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, things like that. So there have been studies that have shown certain strains are beneficial in those certain conditions. But what's very interesting is that when probiotics are given to quote unquote healthy individuals, people in the absence of diseases or conditions like that, we don't really see benefits. You don't really see any sort of dramatic alterations in the microbiome and things like that. And then once you stop taking those probiotics, your microbiome will revert back. So there was actually an interesting study that came out last year, towards the end of last year, that showed that we really don't colonize these probiotics that we're taking. So this was published in Cell, which is a really kind of big deal journal. Typically your journals with just one word are typically your really big deal journals. So
that's a good tip.
I mean, there's different ones there, but
right.
a lot of the big deal journals. So you have Nature, which also has tons of offshoots of it. You have Cell. In the gastrointestinal field, you have Gut. So they've kind of claimed that space. But basically, this one was published in Cell, and it was done in humans, and basically showed that probiotics, when you take them, we can detect those in the fecal samples, which is what people use in humans to measure their gut microbiota. But what you're really measuring when you look at the fecal population of bacteria, you're measuring what's coming out. You're not measuring really what's colonizing there. So what they were actually able to do was to take samples from the actual intestinal environment and sequence that as well, and show that it's different from what's coming out.
So basically you're pooping out your probiotics.
Yeah. So you're not really colonizing a lot of them.
Because it's all about colonizing. So that was kind of one of those questions I wanted to make sure we're hitting on.
Yeah.
Right now, the gold standard in science about, quote, gut health is diversity, right?
Yeah.
If you have a diverse set of lots of different types of bacteria in your gut, then that's sort of indicative of you're probably healthier than someone who has a really small number, right?
Yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Okay.
So that's something that my mind has changed on over the years with studying it. I actually wrote about this in like a huge paragraph in my dissertation. We always associate diversity is very easy to measure at this moment. We're able to use measures called alpha diversity and beta diversity, which basically are just two different statistical measures of diversity, either comparing what's there to each other or what's there to the group as a whole. It's just a little slight differences there. Alpha diversity is typically what's used a lot of times when we look at diversity. But diversity is looking at the proportions of these bacteria and how they exist in relationship to the whole environment there. And so it's been associated to have a greater diversity with better health outcomes. So with people that have like chronic health conditions or things like that, or even gastrointestinal diseases or conditions, we see a reduced diversity. But diversity does not equal functionality. So when we look at what's super important in the microbiota field is function, rather than just what's there. What is its function? What role is it serving? Because we do see reduced diversity when we, for instance, a lot of studies will show reduced diversity with prebiotic supplementation. So when you add fiber-containing compounds to the diet, you actually reduce diversity. And that's because you're selecting for a specific bacterial population that have specific functions, which those functions are more important for overall health. So that's where the field has kind of reached a sticking point, because we are able now to say what's there, but we now have to really dive into what's there and what does it do. So it's going to be much more detailed in the future.
Okay, that's super fascinating.
Sense?
Yeah, definitely. So also, it's tough to necessarily draw this line and say, yes, diversity is the gold standard, right? It's a little bit tenuous of a conclusion. But what about the opposite? Like, do we know that not having a diversity in your gut is maybe not great? Like, is that a conclusion we can make?
So it's all associative at this point. So I don't like making really
sweeping statements.
Yeah, with
a true scientist.
Yeah, so
you're modeling for us why the media is so jacked up about science, right? Because they do make those sweeping statements.
Yeah. And typically what you'll find in science is that I've talked about this on my Instagram so much, that the science answer, researcher answer is more studies need to be done. So everybody is always hesitant to make a statement, because in science, there's so many variables that need to be controlled, and if one of those is not controlled for, that could greatly influence the outcome of your study. And so when you compare even studies with the microbiome with the same interventions, sometimes you'll get different results. So one of those has been the ketogenic diet. So when people feed a ketogenic diet, sometimes you'll see results of reduced diversity, and sometimes you see results of increased diversity or things like that. So it's really hard to,
right. I guess the reason I'm asking that question is so often in practice, I see folks who like have whittled down their eating so much in the name of health, quote unquote, right? This is also known as like orthorexia. Yeah. Like, oh, I learned I can't eat this, I can't eat that. And then next thing you know, you're only eating a few foods because you're scared of eating all these other ones. Now, there could be lots and lots of reasons for why you might experience gut dysfunction with that type of eating, but one would assume that like that reduced diet or that really non-diverse diet would lead to a non-diverse gut microbiome, right?
Yeah. And so when you cut out things, think about it from the perspective that microbes are really not like us and that we just can eat like whatever, lots of different things. Different microbes are able to better metabolize different compounds and different nutrients. So you have some that are better at protein fermentation and digestion, some actually do like lipid and fat digestion, and then you have all of your fiber fermenters, which fiber is not just like one term. So when we talk about fiber, that's like a huge class of molecules that all have different structures, and each microbes have different set of enzymes to break the bonds of those structures to digest it. So when you are even not eating a diverse sources of fiber, you will see a switch or reduction in certain bacterial populations. So yes, diversity in your diet is super important. And when you're cutting out
diversity meaning variety, right? To translate it into like terms we usually use around nutrition. Just, you think maybe you're being healthy by like, I only eat these certain healthy, quote, healthy foods, but really that's actually not very health promoting in so many ways, but definitely on the gut level too. Like let's not forget like our mental health and like our ability to like be socially engaged with other people and not isolating, right? So there's lots of elements, but for sure with gut health, that's not super health promoting.
No, and again, there needs to be more research to study this, but just how that affects, just knowing the way the microbes interact with nutrients and what they prefer to have. When you're cutting out those things, you are selecting for specific sets of microbes and you're losing some, which in turn will reduce your microbial diversity, which is, while I say it's not the best measure of like gut health or like the gold standard of gut health, it still is a measure that I think we should still look at. We shouldn't throw it out the window and say it's not great, but it's still something we should look at and consider.
Well, it's one of the only things we have right now to really determine, but it might not be perfect is your point, right?
And in science, there's really no perfect. We will come up with things that are quote unquote the gold standard, but everything has its downfalls. There's no perfect study. There's no perfect measure of anything.
Yeah. Great points. I love it. Would this be a good point to talk about what is kind of gut health promoting? Because you kind of mentioned that earlier, and I was wanting to kind of circle back and talk about that.
So when we think about gut health, the common thing just goes to what you're eating, what your dietary patterns look like. And so when I say diet, and I think we've talked about this before, I don't mean like fad diet. I mean
what you eat.
Right. Your habitual patterns of like what you consume, and even that doesn't have to be habitual, but just like what your intake looks like. So that's what I mean when I say diet. So everybody thinks that your diet is the biggest, it's a large driver of what's there in your microbiome, but it's not the only influence for sure. So things that influence our microbiome include stress, which is a massive one. When you are stressed, when you have anxiety and things like that, we know that affects the microbiome, and we know that goes both ways. So that's called the gut-brain axis. When we look, people who have chronic anxiety conditions do have a different microbiome. than people who don't. And then so there's kind of an interplay in that our microbes can affect our anxiety and our anxiety can affect our microbes, and it kind of goes back and forth. And that's even the case for things that are being studied like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. So there are links to the gut microbiome with those as well.
And so that link between which one's causing which, right? Like, is it the gut microbiome such that it produces anxiety, or is it the anxiety that produces a different gut microbiome? That's the gut-brain axis, and that's a big question.
Yeah, so that's the gut-brain axis, and I don't think it's a case of the chicken and the egg. I think it is kind of like a feed-forward mechanism, or just a circular mechanism where they both kind of feed on each other.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't think it's as easy to say as like one's causing the other and the other's causing one. I think it's better to say that, you know, they exist in a relationship that influences each other.
Yeah. So anything else you'd want to say about the gut-brain axis? I mean, that's a super big topic, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, you need to get my husband on to talk about all the gut-brain. So
talk about your husband really quick.
So we actually met during our master's work in North Carolina. And so he's from Missouri and I'm from the Carolinas. So we figured out we wanted to do our PhD. So that was a big feat in of itself, coordinating a place to where we could both do our PhDs. But we ended up both doing gut microbiota research. So he did I was really fascinated with his research. So he was doing research on the gut microbiota and Alzheimer's disease and finding links there. So what you get in Alzheimer's disease is deposition of amyloid beta plaques, and then you have neurofibrillary tangles. So he was looking at things called amyloid beta plaques, and how the microbiome was influencing that, and how consuming certain types of fibers would influence the pathogenesis or progression of Alzheimer's disease, which is really cool. He was doing MRIs and behavioral testing and things like that. So his research was just super cool to me. And I think it's more cool because I wasn't doing it. Does that make sense?
You weren't too intimately involved.
Yeah, you get kind of like burnt out and you're like, oh, I can only talk about pollutants for so long. I want something different. But yeah, his research was really cool. And so he's really the expert on like Alzheimer's disease and gut health and Alzheimer's disease. But what we do know is that there is definitely a link there. But there needs to be more research to tease out exactly how it's influencing it and how we can potentially intervene, because it would be, right now there's really no treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And so that's been the big conundrum in the field. Nothing is effective. Even most dietary measures have failed. And it's really what the field is going down to with this is it's really going to have to be a prevention measure rather than a treatment at this point. So a lot of things are looking at preventatory measures or prevention measures rather than treatment, because treatment seems to be largely ineffective.
Interesting. Okay, I feel like I got you on a tangent. So you're talking about what are gut health promoting things, and you can just kind of be surfacey here, like because we talk about this a lot in our course as well. So
so stress reducing, mental health. If you can manage your stress, we all live in a really highly stressful environment, always plugged into social media and our emails, and it's hard to even separate work from life and things like that. So if you can separate those and engage in things that make you feel well and less stressed, that is, we know that's definitely beneficial for your microbiome. Exercise and movement, that's something that's linked to a more positive microbiome. And so this also comes back to stress. So you can do super high intensity exercise and movement and stress out your gut, which is not helpful. So you have to find something that, brings you joy and feels good in your body. So that's really important.
And that's balanced. And it's not like there is such a thing as too much of a good thing.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, that even comes back to cortisol. So we know that exercise can influence cortisol release, and you do want a certain level of cortisol, which is your stress hormone. But when that's out of whack and way overbalanced, that's when you have issues. So it's kind of everything is just kind of a balance. So finding some form of movement that makes you feel good and is not stress inducing is helpful as well. And then when we come back to like what you eat and things like that, having regularly consuming things that contain fiber is great, but there's also a balance of you don't want too much of that. So again, that's a balance. You can have way too much fiber and stress out your gut and stress out your gut microbes. So that's a very important balance as well. So for some people, they could sit there and eat 60 to 70 grams of fiber a day and be A-okay. I feel like digestion is good, moving along. And then the next person comes in and consumes 30 to 40 grams of fiber and is like, oh, I just feel like bloated and constipated and I just feel like weighed down and just kind of like bleh. So they obviously can't handle that amount of fiber. And that also has to do with your microbiome, like what is there digesting that. So that's why when people start to eat more fiber and incorporate more fiber-rich foods into their diet, it's not good to go from 0 to 100 because your microbes are not prepared for that. You have to kind of like step them into that process as well.
It sounds like what you've studied about the gut really, if we sort of extrapolate a little bit, like really supports a lot of the like more non-diet intuitive eating work in regards to, and I'm going to just kind of shoot from the hip here and then you fill in the blanks. But, if you're engaging in movement that feels good to you and like makes you feel happy, that's something that's like, that I promote in the work that I do. But it's also really cool to know that like the research about the gut supports that as well. Like anyway, and also, with the fiber conversation, yeah, like it's okay to eat fruits and veggies and whole grains, but at the same time, like if you feel super bloated and constipated or have some type of like big GI issue, like listen to your body. It's gonna communicate, hopefully. I mean, in most cases, it's gonna communicate kind of its needs. And so it seems like research supports connection to the way that you feel, which is kind of like duh, but also a little bit profound for some people. Like, oh, I can listen to my body,
Yeah. So something that I think shocks people a lot is research supports a very neutral approach to a lot of things. A very kind of not a very balanced approach to most things. It's usually, oh yeah, just, have this, but not too much. And, too much is a bad thing. And too little is not a great thing either. So research is never like super black and white. It's kind of always living in the gray area.
It's a balance, right?
Yeah, it's all very balancing because our bodies like balance. They like to exist in homeostasis. And when you throw something one direction, you swing that pendulum and your body's like, everything's out of whack. This is not working.
My dog's here too while we're recording. He never barks, but he just got nervous about something. Okay. That's awesome. I wanted to just say one more thing. So you've talked a lot about how the microbes ferment things. Let's just have like a really basic conversation about farting.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, microbes are like, when we say fermentation, so microbes, that's basically we're just saying metabolism by microbes. So we know one of the big byproducts of fermentation is carbon dioxide and certain other gases. And what do gases do in your body? You will feel them and then you will pass them. So farting happens. So
that's a byproduct of your microbes doing their job.
Yeah, it's a byproduct of your microbes doing their job. And so when I study things that are, I do some microbial experiments that exist like in a tube where I'm giving these microbes. So for example, inulin, which is a fiber.
Prebiotic.
A prebiotic fiber. So certain microbes really love this. So I do this in a tube that's capped and sealed in what we call an anaerobic environment. So in the absence of oxygen, which is what our guts are like. Our guts have predominantly no oxygen. So what thrives there are, we call them anaerobic bacteria. So what's really kind of funny is we use syringes for everything. And so after a fermentation, that usually takes place over, if I give the microbes inulin, I'll let them sit for, in their happy little environment for 24 hours or so. When I come to take a sample and I put the syringe in, sometimes it'll blow the syringe out because it's just so powerful with the amount of gas they're producing. And it's also very smelly. So, but yeah.
Ugh, gross.
Yeah. So our microbes produce a large amount of gas. So farting is 100% normal. And based on your microbes there and what you're eating, yeah, you may notice that you feel a little more gassy some days, but a lot of times that's just your microbes reacting to what you ate.
And the reason I ask this is because, in our world right now, there's so many people just saying like, just pathologizing like normal bodily functions, like being a little bit bloated sometimes. Or, I mean, obviously that's not always normal. There's some times that that's not, or passing gas, or whatever else. It's just a normal part of digestion. And I just feel like sometimes we need a reminder, like human beings are supposed to pass gas because our microbes create that as they do their job for us, you know?
And in like the wellness culture and industry, so bloating is like this huge demonized thing. And if you went onto YouTube and typed in the word bloating, there's like tons of fitspos that are like, oh, this is how you reduce bloating. So what's really important is to not confuse bloating with feeling full and having eaten food. So like
preach.
So like you will feel fullness in your body and your stomach might get a little distended. That's 100% normal. When it's to the point where you're in pain and you feel like you have this just massive brick in your stomach and you feel just like it's just like a bubble sitting there, that's usually bloating, and you usually just either have to wait it out, go to the bathroom, or just like pass gas. Like it will go away on its own, and usually engaging in kind of like maybe going for a walk, getting things kind of moving is helpful for that. But I think we've like pathologized this whole idea that feeling after eating a meal, oh, I'm so bloated. No, you're just full. Like,
right. Well, and then what people do in the wellness world is then they're like, well, then don't eat this. This causes bloating, you know, cut more and more stuff out of your eating. And that can actually produce bloating.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So what's super interesting is a lot of people will notice when they go long times without eating, they will feel like these kind of like gassy, bubbly feelings. So you may feel more gassy or bloated if you, quote unquote, bloated, if you go a long time without eating or if you're restricting certain things. So that's something to watch out for too, because you're not feeding your microbes. And, you know, this is just me kind of like thinking outside the box, but maybe they're communicating with you like, feed me. Like, I'm going to make noises and produce a lot of stuff that's going to make you listen and look, like, feed me, kind of things like that.
Yeah. So, in other words, you heard it here first, guys. Everyone farts. It's okay.
It's okay.
Okay. I feel like we've done such a good job covering this topic. Is there anything else that, I mean, I know I want to talk to you about what further studies you think should be done, but before we go there, do you think there's anything we missed so far? No?
I think we're good. Yeah.
Okay. So, because you're a scientist and because you're so intimately involved with this topic, I'm super curious to hear, like, if you could just get funded for a study today about the gut microbiome, what would it be, and what would you look at?
So, yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I really don't want to stay in research because of the stress of funding. That's a whole topic in and of itself. Scientific research funding has decreased, and seems to be continuing to decrease, which makes competition really difficult. But what I really want is, first of all, long-term studies on the microbiome. So we don't have, like I said at the beginning, this field is so young, we don't have really long-term studies on how certain dietary patterns or even stress and things like that affect the microbiome long-term. So that's super important. But as I've gotten into this field of studying kind of like a non-diet approach, intuitive eating and things like that, I really want to see a study on the effects of chronic dieting and yo-yo dieting and things like that on the microbiome over time. Because my hypothesis is that, and we've kind of talked about this, when you restrict certain nutrients, you are selecting for specific bacterial populations, and you're selecting for specific microbes, and you're, quote unquote, kind of killing off other ones. And when you do that, and then you yo-yo diet and say you go off and you just decide, screw it, eat whatever, you will get regrowth of certain bacteria, but my hypothesis is that not all of them are going to come back, and they're going to maybe come back in different abundances. And then you're going to go on another diet, which may look different than the first one. So you're going to then select for another bacterial population and lose some there. So my hypothesis is that over time, you see these fluctuations in the microbiome, and you're going to get continual loss of maybe beneficial bacterial populations that you've lost through restriction. And maybe some of the effects that we see the negative health effects that we see of yo-yo diet and chronic dieting, maybe some of those are linked to the microbiota changes.
And what you're saying makes so much sense. And it also makes me wonder, maybe when we look at like 5 years after someone goes on a diet, the typical trend we see is like a Nike check sign where they lose some weight, gain it back within like maybe 2 years, or about back at that regular level they started at. And then within 5 years are typically higher. Who knows if like that has to do with the microbiome.
Yeah, because your microbiome does have some sort of influence on your energy uptake and what you're absorbing. So maybe your microbes are adapted to kind of say, oh, we got to prevent this person from like quote unquote starving. Like let's extract more calories.
Adjust set point.
Yeah.
Let's extract calories. Let's get more efficient at that just seems totally logical.
It'd be really cool to have a long-term study on that.
Okay, that's your next thing.
Next
your next frontier. Who wants to fund Jessie? An independent, wealthy person?
That'd be nice.
Okay. Well, Jessie, this has been super fun talking with you. I'm sure there's so many things we could have said. This is a really, really big topic, and also so many unanswered frontiers within this big topic. So is there anything else you'd want to say, or do you think we covered a good portion of it?
Just when you're reading, kind of like take home, when you come across things in the media that talk about gut health and things like that, just be very skeptical. Take everything with a grain of salt. And this goes for all of science, all of research, because what you see in the media is often disseminated to you through kind of that childhood game you used to play, telephone. So it's been kind of misconstrued along the way and may not be exactly what the researchers originally intended. Because what you'll find in the research is researchers don't really make these broad, wide sweeping statements and conclusions. And when you see something that just seems definitive in the media, just kind of question that, push back on that idea, and go read the research for yourself. That's something I'm a huge proponent of. So yeah, just be skeptical.
Jessie, thanks so much for joining me. It's so fun to record in person and to talk about such a relevant kind of current thing that a lot of people are wondering about and grappling with. And so hopefully this provides some clarification for people about a really commonly tricky topic.
Yeah, hopefully this is helpful.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for joining me, Jessie.
Yeah, this is great.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.